Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 132, Mary DeKnight. Acknowledgement to Helen Menard, who wrote the story on Mary DeKnight for the Female Convict Research Centre Incorporated. The centre is an amazing source of female convict information, and they've given me permission to reference some information from Helen to help create this episode. Mary DeKnight was a colourful character in the publican business in England, which ultimately sent her across the globe as a convict. However, she became a successful and respected member of the foundational history of Tasmania. Mary outlived two husbands and owned and operated one of the oldest hotels in Hobart. When she sold it, it was described as one of the best and most expensive on the island. Mary was one of the first convict women to settle at Risdon Cove, the founding colonial settlement in Tasmania. Her granddaughter was the first white child to be born on Van Diemen's Land. Mary Maria DeKnight was born in London, Middlesex, England around 1762 and had at least one brother, Jonathan, and a sister, Martha. Mary formed a relationship with James Quinn and they had a daughter, Martha, in 1789. There is no record of a marriage to James Quinn. On the 6th of January 1791, Mary Maria married Henry Hayes at St James's Church at Garlick Hythe, London. Initially, they were involved in selling second-hand clothes as well as other goods, and in May 1800 they were living in Golden Lane. Not long after, they took on the licence of the public house, the Bell, in the Red Lion Market District near Whitecross Street, St Luke's. It appears that Henry and Mary were taken into custody and questioned on several occasions in relation to goods in their possession and testified in several criminal trials, although they were never actually charged. However, in April 1801, Henry and Mary Hayes were indicted for receiving stolen goods from Thomas Collett, alias Putty, and went to trial before Mr Justice Gross at the Old Bailey on the 20th of May 1801. The stolen property was contained in a red leather and brass trunk belonging to John Christian Wepler and included 32 yards of cambric, which was fine French linen, several gold and tortoise shell snuff boxes, diamond, emerald, garnet and pearl jewellery, gold shoe buckles, silver tea sets and cutlery, foreign silver coins, table napkins and various articles of clothing, all to the value of £1,500. John Christian Wepler was a planter from Jamaica and arrived in London with a cart full of trunks and boxes, and he set out looking for accommodation. After several unsuccessful attempts, he finally found lodgings in Covent Garden, whereupon he noticed the red trunk was missing from the back of his cart. He immediately reported the matter to Bow Street Police Station. After 2 days, having heard nothing, he advertised for the return of the trunk and offered a reward initially of £100 and subsequently 150 guineas. A week later, Wepler was contacted by Elizabeth Smith concerning the whereabouts of the trunk, following which arrest warrants were issued for Thomas Collett, Henry Hayes, Mary Hayes and John Faulkner. Elizabeth Smith, who was 21 at the time, was an employee of the Hayes family at the Bell from the 3rd of March to the 5th of May 1801. She testified that a soldier, Collett, also known as Putty, came to the bar at the Bell and showed Mary Hayes the red trunk, which they proceeded to take upstairs. Afterwards, Mary had various items of the jewellery in her possession and later in the bar agreed to pay Collett 6 guineas. Smith gave no evidence of Henry Hayes's involvement, notwithstanding the fact that after being dismissed from Hayes's employment, Smith's new lodgings at the Brown Bear on Bow Street were paid by Wepler. Smith denied ever knowing about Wepler's reward when she reported the matter to the police. Jonathan DeKnight, Mary's brother, later alleged that Smith's testimony was completely fabricated as a way of payback for Hayes sacking her. Despite some misgivings about the evidence, Mary DeKnight was found guilty of receiving and transported for 14 years. Her husband, Henry Hayes, was found not guilty, despite Smith testifying that he was as great a sinner as ever lived, has been often charged with things of this sort. Smith also testified that young Martha Hayes was present during some of the activities, but Martha was never charged. John Faulkner absconded at the time the original warrants were issued, and he went to trial separately in July 1801. Faulkner maintained that Henry Hayes gave false evidence against him on the promise that his already convicted wife would be pardoned if Hayes testified against Faulkner. Nonetheless, Faulkner was convicted and sentenced to transportation for 14 years. Mary's brother, Jonathan Denight, a carpenter, was also later charged with receiving some of the stolen goods from the Red Trunk, but after a trial in February 1802 was found not guilty, presumably on the basis that the court accepted the argument that he had no proprietary interest in the goods and was merely holding them on behalf of his sister. Wepler alleged that Denight was holding the goods in an attempt to elicit a pardon for his sister, testified that he came to my house and told me his sister, who was convicted, knew where some of the property could be found, and if I would intercede for her, she would deliver up the different articles that I'm now in possession of. I said that was not sufficient, but provided she would come forward with more property, I would. He came at different times and always told the same story. While talking about Mary's siblings, there is a record of a Martha Quinn, Mary's sister, in the St Martin's Workhouse records, aged 29, in August 1810. It states that she's in there for the third time, that she was discharged on the 15th of September 1810, but was back by April 1811, but this time she dies there on the 27th of July 1811, aged only 35. Her husband Tobias died only a year later, and sadly all their children started going in and out of the workhouses after this point. So despite the best efforts of some, a pardon never came Mary's way. She was in Newgate prison for over a year, and then she left London on board the convict ship Glatton in September 1802. She arrived at Port Jackson, New South Wales in March 1803, and the records confirm that Mary was accompanied by her daughter Martha. And it states on the shipping record, Martha Hayes, daughter of convict Mary Hayes, who became Lieutenant John Bowen's mistress. Martha was only 14 at the time. Martha proceeded to Van Diemen's Land with Lieutenant Bowen aboard the Albion and arrived at Risdon Cove in September 1803. Mary remained in New South Wales, and it has been suggested that she was assigned to her husband Henry. Mary set up a milliner's business in April 1803. And the article advertising her business says, M. Hayes, milliner and mantua maker at R. Sideways, back of the store, Sydney, respectfully informs ladies that such commands as they may be pleased to honour her with in either of the above branches shall be executed in a style of fashionable taste and neatness, with the utmost punctuality, and on terms that may recommend her to future favour. She also begs to offer her service in making up of childbed linen, in which she flatters herself she may have the happiness to render satisfaction. In January 1804, with Martha being pregnant with the first of his daughters, Lieutenant Bowen returned to New South Wales. Bowen was disillusioned with the failure of Risdon Cove as a foundation settlement, and he had ongoing disagreements with Colonel Collins and Governor King. He wanted to return to England and rejoin the French war effort. Unimpressed, Governor King ordered Bowen to return to Risdon Cove, and arrangements were made for Mary Maria to travel with him to Van Diemen's Land to take care of her pregnant daughter Martha. In the meantime, in November 1803, Mary's husband Henry had arrived at Port Phillip aboard the Ocean as a free settler from England, accompanied by his brother Thomas Hayes and his wife Elizabeth, and their two sons Thomas and William. And it seems Henry then sailed on to Port Jackson in the Calcutta and joined up with Mary Maria. At some stage, Thomas and his family also made their way north to Port Jackson. The voyage for the family to Van Diemen's Land was difficult, and they arrived in Hobart on the 10th of March 1804. Lieutenant Bowen, Mary and Henry Hayes left for Van Diemen's Land via Port Phillip on the Integrity. The Integrity ran aground in Kent's Bay, King Island, and all aboard were transferred to the Pilgrim, which eventually arrived at the River Derwent in March 1804, just before the birth of Mary Maria's first granddaughter, Henrietta. Thomas Hayes and his family followed on to Van Diemen's Land later in 1804 and were some of the first European settlers in the colony. Thomas was given a grant of 100 acres at Newtown Creek, which he called Project Farm. Lieutenant Bowen eventually departed Van Diemen's Land for the last time in August 1804, leaving Martha, again pregnant, and his daughter Henrietta in the care of Mary and Henry Hayes. He sailed for England in January 1805, never again to return to the colonies. Interestingly, Mary Hayes was recorded as a settler's wife, not a convict, on the victualling lists, that is, the list that provided food for Van Diemen's Land for 1803 and 1804, which indicates she may have been given preferential treatment by the authorities, quite likely because of Lieutenant Bowen's departure. In December 1805, Governor King granted Henry Hayes 100 acres of land on the Derwent River to be known as the Henrietta Farm, presumably after his granddaughter. He was to be held for 5 years free of taxes and rents, but timber suitable for naval purposes was to be reserved for the use of the Crown. In 1811, Hayes transferred his land to Charles William Murray. The next the records indicate of Mary Maria is sometime between 1807 and 1810, when she was running the Derwent Hotel in Elizabeth Street, Hobart Town. In June 1810, Mary was granted a free pardon, about 5 years short of the completion of her sentence. Mary's husband Henry Hayes died on the 12th of May 1813 at the age of 51. Mary Maria Hayes married William Thomas Stoker on the 29th of June 1816 at the Derwent Hotel, Hobart, by Reverend Robert Knopwood. And the advertisement in the paper of her marriage was very interesting, as it stated that they married after a tedious courtship of 2 years. On the same day, William placed a notice in the local press as follows: £5 reward, lost a few days ago a silver watch with 2 gold seals and a gold key. Any persons delivering the same to Mr. Thomas William Stoker at the Derwent Hotel, Elizabeth Street, will receive the reward of £5. And a little on William Thomas Stoker. He appeared before the Middlesex Jail Delivery in England on the 28th of April 1802, charged with knowingly having forged and counterfeited banknotes in his possession. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 14 years transportation. William was reputedly a former military officer, and he arrived in New South Wales on the Calcutta in October 1803 and was one of 13 convicts that were transferred to Van Diemen's Land. The journey was not without incident. In 1803, the Calcutta sailed into Port Phillip Bay, where at least 4 convicts escaped, and it was reported that 8 had died on the trip. One of the 4 known escapees was shot on his escape. 2 turned back after 2 days to reattach to the group at the camp in the bay before the boat left, and 1 continued on. William Stoker was one of the first European settlers at Sullivan's Cove, Hobart Town, under Lieutenant Governor Collins. In 1804, he was appointed by Governor Collins as the head of the night watch, whose job was to report to the magistrate whatever occurrences may take place during the night. Several months after Mary and William Stoker's marriage, while staying at Thomas Hayes's residence, they were subject to a robbery by a group of notorious bushrangers. And the description reads, "Another daring depredation committed on Monday at the residence of Mr. Thomas Hayes at Baghdad on the road to Port Dalrymple by one of those bandidos of ruffians who have been too long a terror to the peaceful settler and traveller. Mr. William Thomas Stoker, his wife, and a cart containing property to a considerable amount belonging to them, accompanied by Mr. Andrew Whitehead and family, halted for the night at the premises of Mr. Hayes. Soon after, the party were alarmed by the appearance of bushrangers. They carried off with the following articles, which had been removed from the cart into the house: 2 casks of rum, one containing 11 and the other containing 10 gallons, 2 gallons of gin, 30 pairs of shoes, fancy ribbons to the value of £50, 2 bags of sugar containing about £125 each, a chest of green tea, pepper to the amount of £30, 9 pairs of stays. The whole is estimated at upwards of £300. And there was a government public notice on the 3rd of October 1818. Government public notice, Secretary's Office, Hobart Town. For the information of the public and the particular guidance of the officers of the police establishment, His Honour the Lieutenant Governor has been pleased to order and direct the following list of publicans who are duly licensed for keeping of public houses and vending of wines, spirits and beers in several districts of the country of Buckinghamshire to be published in the Hobart Town Gazette, and at Hobart Town, Thomas William Stoker is named as the publican of the Derwent Hotel. Mary Maria Stoker placed an advertisement in the paper, whereas the undersigned, having become responsible before the Deputy Judge Advocate for all debts contracted by William Bastian, late of the brig Jupiter, with a view to facilitate his proceeding to Sydney, and the said William Bastian having declared in preference of the Deputy Judge Advocate in the whole of his debts only amounted to a few shillings, which the undertook to pay, and attempts have been made to take advantage. The undersigned therefore takes this method of informing the public that he is not responsible for any debts contracted by him on the above date. M. Stoker, Derwent Hotel, 18th of September 1819. The Derwent Hotel was not a business immune from criminal activity. John Thomas, a convict in the service of Mr. Stoker of the Derwent Hotel, was charged with stealing in his master's dwelling house promissory notes amounting to upwards of £20, together with sundry orders on the police fund. And in May 1824, a most daring robbery was committed at the Derwent Hotel. £200 in bank and paper money and £15 in silver money were feloniously stolen and carried away. A reward of $200 is hereby offered to persons who may give such information as will lead to the conviction of the offender or offenders. And in 1821 it was listed that T.W. Stoker had a hut on Macquarie River, and it stated on the picture that it was one of the original stock huts of the colony and that there was no other hut within 6 miles. And there was a sketch of this hut drawn in March 1821. In June 1825, another event regarding bushrangers. Brady and McCabe. On Monday morning at daylight, Mr. Stoker, accompanied by another gentleman, left the neighbourhood of Ross Bridge on horseback, and after proceeding along the road for Hobart Town until within a mile of Mr. Whitfield's at Cross Marsh, they perceived, about 3:30 in the afternoon, a cart standing on the highway at a distance of about 200 yards from them, and at the same moment observed 2 men gently approach it, and apparently without taking the smallest notice of them. On a nearer approach, one of the men looked inside the cart, when Mr. Stoker's companion stated his opinion that they were constables searching for stolen property. Upon this supposition, the travellers boldly went up, and on coming within 10 yards, the 2 men sprang from the cart and presented 2 guns at them, at the same time threatening to blow out their brains if any attempt should be made at resistance. They then commanded the gentleman to dismount and walk into the bush, and they accordingly did so. Mr. Stoker looked back and observed Mr. Bryant with one of his servants, both lying tied on the ground. On arrival at this spot, the shorter man of the 2, whom it is believed was Brady, bound Mr. Stoker's friend with a pocket handkerchief and took from his person £4 in currency notes, a gold watch and several trinkets of considerable value. After losing these articles, he ran off as well as he could towards Mr. Bryant, when Brady commanded Mr. Stoker to allow his hands to be tied, on doing which he also was robbed of his gold watch and appendages, together with several pounds. In this situation the gentleman continued until 5 o'clock, when the robbers untied Mr. Bryant and his servant and allowed them to depart. In a few moments after, Mr. Stoker and his fellow traveller were allowed to proceed on their journey, but the bushrangers detained their horses under a promise of sending them on to Mr. Whitfield's by his servant, whom they had taken away during the afternoon. From the frequent opportunities of conversing with Mr. Bryant, which were afforded to his fellow sufferers, it was found that he had been detained since 8 o'clock in the morning and robbed of £11 in banknotes. About an hour after, the dismounted party arrived at Mr. Whitfield's. The servant returned without their horses and informed them that the robbers had mounted them and rode off. Mr. Stoker has, since his arrival in Hobart Town, communicated the preceding circumstances to His Honour the Lieutenant Governor, who we trust will employ all the means in his power towards expediting the capture of the banditti. From a variety of very suspicious circumstances, we are led to believe that several assigned servants up the country are in league with these audacious ruffians. After writing the above, we learn from authentic sources that Brady and McCabe have been since seen in a different quarter and are recognised as the freebooters who made the attack. Bryant and Brady were both hung on the 4th of May 1826. In 1829, Daniel Leary was convicted of stealing a steer from William Stoker valued at £5, and James Ellis was charged with absconding from the hired service of Mr. Stoker. On his expressed contrition, Mr. Stoker abandoned further proceedings, and James Ellis was discharged. It seems that William was a man of many talents. He operated a fresh meat store, initially in partnership with Edward Miller and later as a sole operator. He was also a horse breeder who provided the services of his Suffolk stud Sam for all the interested mares in the district. In March 1832, William was described as having a long experience in colonial matters and the correct judgment as an agriculturist, and he travelled aboard the Merope to the Swan River, presumably at the request of the authorities, to report the condition of the settlements in Western Australia. He returned in August in the same year on the Mary Ann with positive findings about the state of the settlements, crops, timber, livestock and whaling at Swan River, Port Augusta and King George Sound. He also noticed the friendliness of the natives, who presented me with spears and waddies, in return for which I gave them biscuits. In fact, just as he was about to set sail from Fremantle, William executed his will, stating that life at times can be uncertain. Mary and William seemed to be highly regarded in the Tasmanian community. They were at various stages executors and administrators of the estates of non-family members. They also displayed their generosity and humanity when a young, somewhat naive journalist, George Gallard, was fined £100 and imprisoned for 12 months. The case was extremely controversial at the time, both with respect to the charge and the sentence given. Gallard was convicted of libelling the government, essentially accusing it of murder, in relation to the excessive flogging of a prisoner that led to the prisoner's death. Abandoned by his profession and penniless, Mary provided Gallard with regular meals, and William set up a fund raising money for his survival. Part of the reporting of this was as follows. Our blood chills in our veins as we write the disgraceful truth that on Friday last a human being, a colonial subject, an Englishman, expired under the tortures of the lash. This is the 19th century in a Christian land and under religious administration in what few will give credence to, but such is the lamentable and disgraceful fact. We have heard that the influence of a bribe was in operation on this occasion, but as the colonial authorities will, of course, for their own credit's sake, cause a full investigation of circumstances that take place, we shall wait a reasonable time before we drag the parties before the light of day, in the hope that they will remit the reward due to their barbarity. William Stoker has died on the 29th of October 1837, leaving his entire estate, which was valued at £1,500, to my ever-beloved wife, Mary Maria Stoker. After more than 20 years together, Mary's life must have taken on a different pace following William's death. After all, by this time she was well into her 70s. She had inherited substantial amounts of land at Longford, Launceston and Glenorchy. She put the Derwent Hotel up for sale 6 months after William's death and sold it shortly thereafter for £3,000, reflecting a significant rise in the value of property at the time. Maria, after much toil and labour, retired very comfortably, but one wonders what happened to the money. Her personal estate, everything except real estate, was only valued at £100 when she died 5 years later, and she'd also sold the substantial property of 62 acres at Glenorchy in 1841, which was 4 years after her husband's death. Mary Maria Stoker, when she died, was aged 80, and that was on the 12th of January 1843, and her death was described as a decay of nature, so old age. And she was recognised as one of the oldest residents in the colony and much respected by a large circle of friends. She died at the home of her granddaughter, Mrs. Garrett, in Hobart Town. Mary Maria had executed her will a week before she died and made her granddaughter, Martha Charlotte Garrett, her sole executor, left all her bedroom furniture to her and a set of china, plus £25 to her granddaughter Mary Whitehead. She left £25 to her daughter Martha Williams, and all her real estate and the residue of her personal estate to her granddaughter Martha Charlotte Garrett. Her granddaughter Martha was married to Dr. Robert Garrett, but he died 10 years into their marriage, leaving Martha with 4 very young children. So as mentioned, she died at her granddaughter's home, so it's quite likely that Mary Maria moved in with Martha to help rear her children. Martha Charlotte never remarried, and that's quite probably why she got the largest share of Mary Maria's estate. Mary Maria's other granddaughter, Mary Whitehead, had not married by the time the will was written, and the token gift of £25 to her daughter Martha might well have reflected the disapproval of her daughter running off and marrying a man 30 years her junior. Mary Maria certainly had an entrepreneurial background, albeit at times pushing the legal boundaries. Marketing stolen goods inside her publican's business in England ultimately earned her a convict's ticket. Undeterred, though, she managed to avoid cross swords with the law in her new country, and she became a respected and successful member of the foundation of the colony. Few female convicts achieved the same. So a little more detail on her daughter Martha and why Mary Maria may have ended up being disapproving of her daughter. Well, as mentioned earlier, Martha was the daughter of Mary Maria and James Quinn. She was most probably born in 1789 in England. Martha took on the name of her stepfather, so Hayes, but when she married in Van Diemen's Land in 1811, she actually named herself Martha Hayes Quinn on her marriage certificate. As mentioned earlier, Martha, being the mistress of Lieutenant John Bowen, the first governor of the new colonial settlement at Risdon Cove, meant that she was the first European woman to set foot on Tasmanian soil at Risdon Cove in September 1803. They first lived in a tent and then a wooden hut. John Bowen then began building a new house for them both about half a mile up the valley. They called it the Governor's New House, and it was in a commanding position overlooking their old hut and the parade ground. On one occasion, when a party of Aborigines approached the camp, Martha panicked and ran and sought the assistance and protection of Dr. Mountgarrett. A convict, Joseph Parnell, who had been transported after the 1798 United Ireland Rising, had been chosen as a servant to John and Martha, and it's believed he became quite attached to the young lady. By all accounts, Martha was a beauty. A visiting Irishman in late 1805, Joseph Holt, described her as the prettiest violet that I ever saw growing at the Derwent. Bowen never married Martha, quite possibly due to the social differences between them. John Bowen was from a very distinguished family. Martha, on the other hand, was illegitimate and her mother was a convict. Martha appeared to have been a respected member of the founding society in Van Diemen's Land. She ran a successful farming property in her own right, and even though John Bowen did leave her with 2 children, he made certain that Martha and the 2 girls were well provided for on a well-established farm on the western side of the river, setting her up with a farmhouse and livestock before he left in August 1804. Bowen also arranged for Martha to be declared a settler, allowing her to receive a grant of land and government rations. Martha did receive a 50-acre grant which bordered on the area of the Glenorchy municipality, which is now known as Prince of Wales Bay, and Bowen saw to it that a hut was built for her there. Prior to Bowen leaving Van Diemen's Land, he asked Reverend Knopwood to take a special interest in Martha's welfare and the children. Bowen sailed on the ocean to the Australian mainland, leaving Martha and daughter Henrietta behind in August 1804. He then sailed for England in January 1805 on the Lady Barlow, and as captain from 1806 to December 1809, he was on the Camilla, which in 1807 and 1808 took part in the blockade of Martinique and Guadeloupe. In February 1811, he wrote to Robert Peel, Under Secretary of the State for the Colonies, suggesting that he should succeed Collins as Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land. This was subsequently rejected, as it was believed that as a naval officer he could not command troops. John Bowen in 1812 to 1816 served in the Salsette on the India Station, and then he returned to England on the 13th of May 1825. He then married Elizabeth Close. After a long illness, he died at Ilfracombe in October 1827 at the age of only 42. As Knopwood became older, that care was returned. Martha took great pride in looking after his welfare, and there was obviously a close connection between them. In 1813, Reverend Knopwood gave the Bowen girls a Bible. So the 2 girls that she had out of wedlock with Lieutenant Bowen, the firstborn Henrietta was born in March 1804, quite possibly named after Henry Hayes. Henrietta was the first white child to be born in Tasmania. Reverend Knopwood recorded in his diary on the 29th of March whilst visiting Bowen, Governor Bowen's young friend was confined to her bed. This records the birth of Henrietta, and Henrietta died in June 1823 unmarried. The death record states, The Hobart Town Gazette recorded on the 21st of June 1823, died, on Saturday night of last, much beloved and respected Miss Henrietta Bowen, daughter of John Bowen, Esquire, Captain in the Royal Navy. Her suffering she bore in piety and with resignation, and departed this life. She is sincerely lamented by all who had the pleasure of her acquaintance. The second daughter that John Bowen did not meet was Martha Charlotte, and she was born on the 3rd of April 1805. Reverend Knotwood christened both daughters in August 1805 on a wet winter's day. Martha Charlotte married Dr. Robert Garrett, a surgeon, in 1823, and the marriage record in the Gazette said, married by special licence by the Reverend William Bedford, Colonial Chaplain at St David's Church, Robert Garrett, Esquire, Assistant Surgeon on the civil establishment at this settlement, to Miss M.C. Bowen, daughter of Captain John Bowen of the Royal Navy. John Bowen actually sent a silver plate as a wedding gift, so he had not forgotten her. Martha and Robert Garrett had 4 children. Robert died in 1834 in Tasmania, leaving Martha with their youngest child being only 2. Martha died at Caulfield, Victoria in 1891 at the age of 86. Their mother Martha then married Andrew Whitehead in 1811. He was her neighbour. Andrew was one of the Calcutta convicts who arrived in Hobart Town in February 1804 with David Collins when he was 18 years old. He was appointed to take charge of the government farm at Cornelian Bay. It was not his first marriage, his first wife Elizabeth having died in 1809. Andrew and Martha enjoyed a social life, and their home became a central point of the new small town community. Governor Lachlan Macquarie from New South Wales visited their farm and stated of Whitehead that he was a respectable farmer. It is believed the first racetrack in Tasmania was established at their farm in 1813. In that year, they received more land at Newtown and were accustomed to receive visits from Reverend Knotwood. Whitehead, however, was involved in a scandal in the following year while smuggling liquor. The liquor was smuggled from the vessel Argo to Cornelian Bay and toted to Whitehead's farm. Governor Davey, who followed David Collins, sentenced Whitehead to a few days' house arrest as punishment. Smuggling was not a serious crime in the new colony. And the government public notice on Saturday, October the 3rd, 1818, states, for the information of the public, His Honour the Lieutenant Governor has been pleased to order and direct the following list of publicans who are duly licensed for keeping public houses and vending of wine, spirits and beer in several districts of the county of Buckinghamshire, published in the Hobart Town Gazette. And Andrew Whitehead is listed with an inn at Herdsman's Cove. Martha had 2 children to Andrew. Mary, born on the 4th of April 1813 in Hobart. She married Thomas Devine on the 29th of May 1851 in Brighton, Tasmania, when she was 38. They had a daughter, Charlotte Martha Ann Devine, on the 13th of September 1854 in Tasmania, and a son, William Edward Devine, in 1857. Mary died on the 14th of September 1886 in Hobart, aged 73. And the next child, Andrew Jr., was born on the 29th of December 1820, but he died at only 2 weeks old in Hobart. Andrew Whitehead died in 1832 at the age of 64, when Martha was 43. No doubt Martha had retained some of her early beauty, for in January 1836 she married again. She was 47 and she married Bernard Williamson, a police clerk at Brighton, who was 28. Even so, she outlived her husband when he died in 1843. Martha then lived at her son-in-law's farm, Lee Farm, at Browns River in the Kingborough municipality. Martha was the last of the first colonial settlers to die in Tasmania on the 10th of July 1871. Stated the last of the first. Our obituary notice records the decease of Mrs. Martha Williamson at the residence of her son-in-law, Mr. Thomas Devine of Browns River, in the year 1803, 68 years ago, when this colony was founded. The deceased, then Miss Hayes, was the first white woman, or rather English young lady, for which she was only 17, that set foot on the island. With the exception of one lady who still survives, it is supposed that the deceased was the last of the immigrants who formed a first British settlement in the land that we live in.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.